this is one important person for us, one of our pioneers in clustering and in TCI. He has always brought a lot of new knowledge to TCI, and always the Asian perspective, because he's an expert on Asia, mainly on China, and has built many connections from there to the world. So I think it's great, Michael, that you are with us today. We have asked him to talk about the future of collaboration, and we have put a number 2026 as the future. Michael, I hand over to you. Thank you for being with us also this year in the Asian conference.
Okay, great. Yeah, great to be here with everyone. Let me see if I can share my screen properly. Okay, so I think I need to swap my displays, right? Are we okay now? Are you seeing my first
Yeah, very nice, very nice.
Okay, great. Takes a little bit of doing, and I used to write the software to do this stuff. It's a pleasure again to be here, and it's also great to see not only the progress being made within TCI, but again the progress being made through MOC in Asia for reasons that'll become clear in a couple of minutes. So I haven't necessarily restricted myself to the 2026 timeframe, but I'd like to talk a bit about the future of collaboration with Asian characteristics. And we'll hear some detailed specific examples. I've actually chosen some fairly extreme examples that I'll talk about in a few minutes. First off, again, there are many trends, obviously, that we've already heard about. I'll just pick out a couple: the geopolitical, public health, and technological. Why do I pick those out? Because in a sense, they create both challenges and opportunities when it comes to collaboration. Because with what's going on geopolitically, what we're seeing is a more fractious world, a partial decoupling of major economies. And in some ways, that makes collaboration, at least of some forms, more difficult. Then we see the public health challenges associated with COVID, where again, even though, as was pointed out, it has fostered in some senses and across some clusters greater collaboration. On average, what's happened with COVID is actually, it's been a huge detriment to collaboration both inside and across organizations. So the cluster groups may actually be an exception there. And then, of course, technological, where basically the technology helps us interact, but it's not going to be a panacea. And over-reliance on technology doesn't necessarily help us either, because there are some forms of collaboration that are really difficult to do if there has not been at least some level of face-to-face interaction. And I'll come back to that as well. Sorry, there we go. Geopolitical influences, decoupling and coupling. What a lot of people fail to recognize that the decoupling or the trade tensions between China and the West actually started well before the last US administration. It was with the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, the Made in China 2025 program announced in 2015, the Digital Silk Road Initiative announced in the same year, the more recent manifestation in terms of dual circulation, which, to oversimplify from a Chinese standpoint, is to make the PRC, the Chinese mainland, less dependent on the rest of the world, while making the rest of the world more dependent on the PRC. And then there's the China International Payments System, the substitute for GPS, etc. And these initiatives, which really started ranging from 2013 through to 2020 or so, have been attempts to selectively decouple China from dependence on the rest of the world. It involves protection, information policies. If we have segregated data, it's hard to collaborate around data. It's industrial policies, asymmetric trade and investment policies, quest for self-sufficiency, security concerns. And those combined with the Western responses, actually first in Europe and then the US, provides the potential for a global environment for some industries, a bifurcated sort of east-west environment for some other industries, and a much more fragmented global environment for others. So among my corporate clients, one of the things we're working through with each of them is whether their industry is likely in the future to be global in nature, whether there's going to be a bifurcated, a two-part world, or whether many parts. And then, of course, with the more recent invasion of Ukraine, which highlighted certain dependence of Western Europe on Russia, but also on Russian and Ukrainian food and resources, Russian and Ukrainian positions in supply chain. And while a lot of that impact has been most directly felt in Europe, it's been felt in Asia and the rest of the world as well. And this is another decoupling, again, with long-term consequences that, we are only beginning to think about what that will be going forward. So the impact on collaboration of these geopolitical influences is that it makes it more difficult for companies and clusters. It makes it more difficult for some forms of collaboration, particularly collaboration across particular borders. But some other forms of collaboration may be increasing. But some of that I'll question isn't really collaboration. And I'll actually answer that conundrum in a little bit. Okay. So clearly a tension that affects collaboration. COVID itself, of course, there have been the public health responses, lockdowns and partial lockdowns, impacts on supply, impacts on demand, impacts on logistics. I'm on the board of directors of a company that supplies the automotive sector. Our logistics costs have gone up by more than a factor of 10 over the last year. So containers that used to cost $2,500 to go from East Asia to North America or Europe are now in some cases costing $25,000 if you can get them. Clearly a major disruption for that company and its supply chains. And the unfortunate fact of the matter, and we've been telling our clients, both government and corporates, this since basically March of 2020, and that is there will continue to be waves of COVID as long as there are countries that become reservoirs where the public health systems cannot control or eradicate. Because viruses mutate. That's what they do. And hopefully, as time goes on, the virus will become less and less serious. But we have not seen the end of COVID. And what that also means is that the mix of policies around the world, with some governments trying to adopt a live with COVID strategy and others a zero COVID strategy, means that disruptions can be quite quick, right? Because under a zero COVID strategy, you have a case, you lock down an area. If that area is vital for a particular industry or even global supply chains, of course, the rest of the world notices. So in addition to the resources required, obviously, for public health, which is the most important thing, we need resilient and multiple sources of supply. We need businesses to become more public health conscious, if not public health experts. and the potential for duplication, inventory stockpiling, and other forms of insurance necessary in the business world just make it more difficult, more costly to operate, particularly for small, medium-sized enterprises that rely on multi-part supply chains for their business. What are some of the impacts on collaboration? Well, some uptick in collaboration in the midst of the emergency, as Loretta pointed out, across public health issues, and where, again, there were established information networks that could be leveraged to try to deal with the emergencies of the crisis. But people are getting exhausted with dealing with an emergency, right? It's hard for people to go 24/7 in the face of an emergency for 6 months, no less 2 years. And on average, and again, my client base, my consulting firm, is a mix. Governments, national, regional, local is about a third. Large Western multinationals is about a third. And medium and large size Asian companies is about a third. And what we've seen throughout the corporate world is a drop in collaboration within the organizations. Why? People aren't seeing each other that often. Every study of innovation ever done basically indicates that it's the unplanned interaction of people with complementary skill sets that drives the innovation process. And that's exactly the type of interaction and collaboration that's difficult to do when you don't have the informal interaction that you get through personal travel. It's hard to schedule that through Zoom meetings. And on average, there's been a drop in collaboration between organizations. And that is everything from buyers and suppliers not visiting each other anymore. They can do the deals over Zoom, but they can't walk through the factory. They can't get the implicit insights necessary to predict what the customer wants or needs for the next 6 months. So the communication is less complete. In the average face-to-face interaction, 50% of the information that's communicated is communicated through non-verbal means. And so our communication has been stunted. It makes it more difficult to collaborate. And people are actively resisting in many quarters a return to the status quo ex ante, going back to the office, trying to reestablish. It's just been depressing, and people have gotten into the habit of staying at home, and the inertia of getting over that, putting aside whatever it is they're going through to get to the office is becoming a significant barrier. Now, technology will help, clearly, because certainly some communication is better than none. And once people know each other at a certain level, then actually a remarkable amount of the needed information can be communicated over the technology. However, technology is not a substitute for face-to-face. It's not a complete substitute. And where it hurts is setting up collaboration, driving the innovation process, incorporating new people into networks. Those are the things that allow our networks to grow and become more supercharged. That's very difficult to do purely through technology. So we have some issues. But in the face of these issues, collaboration is going to be even more important, because we've got collaboration for survival, we've got collaboration for resilience, and of course we need collaboration for innovation in a more and more difficult world with all of the pressures that have already been described. And through this face-to-face online product flows and information flows, they also carry content that's important. So it's going to be as important, if not more important, as we move from survival mode. In some cases, there'll be more and some less for collaboration. again, the emergency rationale goes away. We have more travel, but again, as people withdraw, human nature may make it more difficult. And the key is actually going to be the notion of community, shared interests, interdependence, and overcoming some of the habits that have been built up over the last few years. I was cooped up for a year within about 10 meters of my refrigerator, right? This was a very bad thing. And I need to be, cooped up or not cooped up. I need to be coming and, visiting people like you. Clusters business networks, as Marita already said, can be key to the process. It's a natural mechanism, bring together collective interests to improve resilience, particularly for SMEs, to interact with governments and multilaterals that have become more important to identify and work towards shared interests. But only if the clusters and networks can really take on, understand these roles, take them on, leverage what it is that they can do. And again, TCI is very active in this regard. But what about Asia? I haven't said anything much about Asia so far. Well, the striking thing always to me in comparing clusters in Asia to clusters in the rest of the world is that it has always struck me that clustering in Asia has been more about co-location than collaboration. Certainly, on average, it's been more about co-location than the type of inter-firm collaboration that we tend to see most developed in Europe. It's often been horizontal rather than vertical. It's been assembly in a series of industries. It's been across a range of agricultural goods. It's been more horizontal than vertical, with deep up and down supply chains, one supplying the next, with all the equipment, the inputs, the technology, the software, the hardware, all being developed in the same place. That historically has not been the case in Asia, with the exception of just a few of the economies. In most instances, still in Asia, clusters as we know them, or cluster organizations, are organized by national governments. Or the clusters, the interplay between clusters is through the sourcing and other activities of large multinationals or trading companies that still organize a lot of the trade and production around Asia. And in many parts of Asia, of course, we're seeing responses to the changes that we've mentioned, but they're being organized in many cases around the traditional frameworks. And that's one of the things I find interesting. So I'll give just a couple of examples of that. If I can switch my slide properly. Okay, sorry, I think I missed one. There we go. Okay, many of us know the Singapore economy quite well, but really what exists as clusters and clustering and cluster policies in Singapore is basically at present the doubling down of a program that was developed by Singapore's Committee for the Future Economy in 2016, 2017, where a group of experts from the private sector, analysts, industry participants, officials, basically engaged in a government-led study program and then government-led initiatives to develop and then execute industry technology maps across clusters comprising 80% of the economy. And collaboration is more between government and universities, government and research institutes, and government and companies in terms of providing education, training, and infrastructure rather than inter-firm collaboration. And the overall strategies that were outlined would be familiar to any of us who've worked on clusters, right? Trade and investment cooperation, deepen knowledge, deeper skills, strengthening the innovation ecosystem, building digital capabilities. Connectivity here means connectivity through digital infrastructure and through transportation infrastructure. It's not the sort of, intercompany connectivity that we may talk about. It's implementing these industry transformation maps and then partnering. But again, it's government working with trade associations, government working with unions, government working with chambers, and then government working with companies. To give you an idea, this is just the highlight of one of 23 different ITMs. This is just the headline, and there's like a 70, 80-page document behind this, which again is being rolled out and implemented. And I actually have worked on a number of these where we've actually looked at where the collaboration is needed. Now, this is a very complicated slide, and unfortunately, I don't have permission to divulge what the cluster was here. But one of the things we did is we traced through the input-output tables where all the physical flows, all the sourcing, who is buying and selling within the economy, goods and services related to this cluster. But then we also went and found out where every industry in the cluster was getting its information, where they were getting their information in terms of market and competitive knowledge, business operational knowledge, technology knowledge, and also who within the cluster they communicated with on a regular basis. And you see all the red here? The red is really weak linkages and very little communication. The blue is strong, and there's not much blue here. So basically, there was very little communication within a cluster where the government thought there was, and where industry representatives claimed there was lots of interaction, lots of collaboration, etc. When we went to pin it down, it simply wasn't there. And another thing that was interesting, and this slide's impossible to read, but it is an aid memoir to me. What we found is when we compared the information flows and the actual purchases of goods and services, the correlation between do you get your information from the same place you get your inputs or you sell to, the answer on average is no. That correlation is either very low or in some cases negative. So when people do cluster analysis and they just trace the supply networks and the direct technology spillovers, what we found is that they're actually missing the vast majority of where the knowledge comes from, and that even on a very small island, in a cluster which is located in a very small part of the very small island, that the potential for collaboration, particularly in terms of information flow, was absolutely massive. Okay, so that's one example. Another example I'll use comes from the PRC, actually a few examples, and it goes completely the other way. It goes not from a little island, but some programs and policies that sort of span the world. Basically, the PRC has doubled down on its policies that it has done over the last 10 years, all amalgamated now into the 14th five-year program. One of these, of course, is the Belt and Road Initiative, which has now signed up 140 countries with MOUs, collaboration on infrastructure, investment promotion, and even economic planning. So in some ways, China may be trying to decouple from the West, but it's trying to couple with all of the neighboring economies. And we're seeing the potential here for some clusters that may span literally dozens of companies, all linked back through Chinese investment, right? So that's a potential for, in some senses, collaboration, that we haven't seen, certainly on that multinational scale within Asia in the past. And then the Made in China 2025 program is the top-down, we will develop world-class clusters in these 10 industries. Individual cities and parts of cities have been given the mandates to develop various of these sectors. And it's a typical top-down industrial policy move. Where's the collaboration? Well, it's top-down, you will collaborate. And that's sort of the story there. And I'll skip these in the interest of time. So basically, it brings up the question, will the future of collaboration be different in Asia than elsewhere? And I claim yes, because it always has been. It's been more top-down, particularly government, business, and even within businesses. Many large Asian companies are incredibly hierarchical, without as much cross-fertilization horizontally as you would see in a European or American company. More of the international economy in Asia is organized through big multinationals and trading companies than would be the case in Europe or North America, where much more of it is small, medium-sized companies, increasingly linked through cluster-like organizations or explicit cluster organizations. And because historically, with a few exceptions, most of the economies of Asia haven't really been focused on adding value through innovation, it means that they haven't had to have the type of collaboration that drives the innovation process. But of course, that's changing. Now, actually, because of the challenges, and in some cases, the hit that collaboration has taken over the last couple of years, comparatively, it actually benefits Asia in the short run. Singapore is going way, dead on ahead with its previous policies. PRC, dead on ahead with its previous policies. They haven't had to adjust. However, the pressure is on all economies. Increasingly, as Asian economies become more innovation driven, they will need to have the collaboration that historically they haven't had, which is why the work that's being done in MOC, in my opinion, is so important to try to extend that form of collaboration, because that's going to be critical going forward. Because the short-term benefit will turn into a long-term problem, and some of the traditional approaches and attitudes in Asia are going to have to adjust in order for that to happen. And let me stop my prepared remarks there, and we'll send it back to our moderator.
Thank you very much, Michael. We have a question here, Carmen. Again, if you want to address it personally to Michael.
Sure, thanks. I just had, I think that Michael will be very happy to take questions on anything on the chat. Would be good. My question, Michael, is I think you mentioned early on that people are staying more withdrawn. And you said after COVID, people have stayed home and maybe been less willing to come back to work, that people are staying a bit more introvert and withdrawn. Building on that comment, are there lessons that companies can learn to help and encourage people to actually get involved in collaboration more? I mean, is it that people don't want to come back to the big offices? Nobody wants to be in an open plan office anymore? Or is it that companies need to encourage smaller teams or make sure that people really feel valued, something like this? Are there lessons that companies can learn in your view?
Yeah, it's all of the above. In some quarters, there is fear. COVID is still around. I have in my household a stage 4 cancer patient, right? I cannot afford to get COVID. So there is that. But there's also just the inertia and the malaise that has developed over the last few years. And what I tell my corporate clients to do is they got to get people back in the office one way or another, whether that's through social events or whatever it is. And even if it's not 5 days a week, that they've got to gradually bring people back. Companies have found that that has been a very large drain on productivity in many cases over the last few years. So that's one. One is just getting people back. Another is if that's not going to work, then it is the smaller teams. Bring smaller teams back, get people familiar with each other again. It's basically, I tell people, once your teams are finishing each other's sentences, then they're back. But another thing is to plan for unplanned interaction. I tell my clients that are still running things through Zoom sessions to open up the Zoom sessions a half an hour early and randomly place people in breakout rooms just so they interact. And then after the meeting, leave the Zoom meeting open for another half hour. But this time you have it so that people can self-select into breakout rooms. Why? Because how do things get done in a meeting? They don't get done in the meeting. What happens is two people coming out of the meeting say, well, what does this mean? What does that mean? They say, okay, let's sit down, let's iron this out, boom, and then something goes ahead, and that's how things get done. So it's a matter of trying to figure out what the gap is and then substitute, right? And to try to make that the new normal and to try to leverage that.
Okay, I think that's really important. Thanks, Michael. I really think that the motivation, building teamwork, building social capital, I think that those are really important in collaboration. Thanks so much. Okay.
Michael, we have another question here from Deborah Gosal. Great keynote. Could you give us examples on successful clusters in the past which have faced crisis due to COVID? What can these clusters adapt to again succeed?
Well, I think everybody probably has their examples. There are some that, I mean, quite frankly, have been flat on their back. Every tourism cluster in the world, if they didn't get some sort of funding from government, basically the companies went out of business, and one hopes that when business starts coming back, new companies will take their place. It's been amazing to me to see how many companies have been incredibly creative in identifying new sources of supply, in identifying new logistics arrangements. Again, the company that I mentioned before, we had our logistics costs go up by a factor of 10. Our input costs go up by a factor of 10. And if anyone has ever sold to the automobile industry, you'll realize that the automobile industry had record profits last year because supply was down, demand was up, and the auto industry refused to pay any of the increased costs to their suppliers. How do you survive? You go to management, you cut everybody's salary. You put people on zero salary at the management level for a while. You go to the workforce, you do deferred salaries. You go to your banks, the ones that have been the good banks to you, you get them to lend to help you across the crisis. If necessary, you make part of the factory start making PPE for to help battle the public health crisis. I mean, people have literally pulled out the stops to do anything they could in order to survive, and that's not specific to any one cluster. That's across multiple clusters, and I'm sure all of the attendees will have examples they've run into.
Thank you. More questions to Michael? I have a question. How about the policy side? Do you see some changes in the future policies, specifically in Asia? Are they going in the same direction and as the last years, or all these disruptions are taking governments in a different direction?
They're taking governments in a different direction to the extent that these are new and in some cases unprecedented issues. But what I do not see is any movement towards a different approach towards decision making. The two examples I gave, Singapore thinks it's got it about right and thinks that it's only through very firm planning and guidance from above that a small country like Singapore can navigate a global crisis like this. And in China, again, China is becoming more and more confident that its approach is the right approach, and the alternative approaches that others have suggested in the past is not the appropriate approach. So those countries have basically doubled down on their decision-making process. Singapore was actually very clear and very open in discussing all of the policy steps with the population, and if not, asking permission, informing along the way. PRC has not always been, that hasn't always been the case. But in both places, it's clearly top down. Hong Kong, it's clearly been top down, and they sort of haven't gotten the parts right that Singapore got on the one hand, and they maybe haven't gotten the parts right that the PRC government has gotten right on the other hand. Other places, again, the other places represented here, the other individuals are more qualified than I to comment.
Thank you, Michael. More questions from the panel, from participants? Then thank you very much, Michael. A very big virtual applause to you. Thank you.
Thank you much. It's great to see everybody. I think I am going to sign off because it is about 3 a.m. my time, and I do actually have a busy morning starting at about 8.
Of course, take a rest now.
And look forward to meeting with you all again. Any questions, comments, do feel free. The organizers have my email. Do feel free to send them on, and I'll respond as soon as I can.
Will do. Thank you, Michael. And I hand over to Ken for the next session. Ken,
super.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patricia, and thanks again, Michael. That really was, as the comments were on the chat, was inspiring. And we will be talking to you about this for a long time to come.